Okay, so part two. So that was quick. I went up to help, and my wife already had the situation well under control. But it's okay. I'll just rip these back together with either I'll put them in PowerPoint or with StreamYard or something. So I was kind of touching on this idea that what I want you to do is pick one of these people, and maybe someone that you're a little less familiar with, although I'm cool with you going in any direction, and get into it. Like, who was Viktor Frankl? Why is his ideas of logotherapy so interesting? And you've heard me in this course already talk a little bit about his time in Auschwitz and how like he came up with these ideas when under incredible pressure. And then he came out and ended up writing this book, Man's Search for Meaning, that became like one of the most read psychology books of all time. One that I've recommended to lots of people, or like Sigmund Freud almost goes without saying, and Anna Freud I've been talking about today. Carl Jung, like maybe the most interesting one of this entire list, right? And I've made the point earlier of like, why isn't he more of, you should all be taking full courses on Carl Jung. It's interesting why it's not included. It's like 20 years ago it was included. It's like, it's a little too, it doesn't fit as well. Carl Rogers, Humanistic Psychology. Carl Rogers, and I made the point in the other presentation, probably the person that had the single biggest influence on the development of counseling. You got Piaget, and his idea of genetic epistemology, or that our epistemology, our framework for interpreting reality, is actually genetically going through these sequential changes that in our course we're calling them his cognitive stages of development. But remember, Piaget is talking about more than just that. Piaget is maybe the most underhyped psychologist of all time, meaning like somebody whose name should be more known, even though it's very known. The other one is Spellrein, for sure, and I'll get to her. So then William James, I had talked about a bit earlier about how his role in just the development of psychology in general. He has a book, which I won't waste your time trying to find quick to grab, but a 2-volume book called Principles of Psychology that was written in the 1890s at sometime. I don't remember the specific year, and was really like, in that book he talks about things like perception and sensation, and about things like instincts and things like hypnosis, and all things that you would sort of recognize as psychology related topics. So that's pretty interesting because that predates even Freud. Erik Erikson, we've talked about a lot in the course. I probably don't have to touch on him much. Erich Fromm, another interesting one. And he kind of goes this other direction, right? And he's trained in psychoanalysis. And without going too much into it, he sort of slips more into this group that becomes known as the Frankfurt School, who try to kind of mix Freudian ideas with Marxist ideas and become this. The Frankfurt School became, I'm forgetting the name change when they came to the States, or maybe that's when they become called the Frankfurt School. But it's basically this attempt to, you're seeing manifestations now, this attempt to merge a psychoanalytic understanding of the unconscious with a class struggle narrative of Marxism. It's basically trying to merge those two things. And Erich Fromm was sort of involved in that circle in interesting ways. But then he also wrote books like, it's not called The Psychology of Love, but it's like, has the word love in the title. Sorry, I'm kind of just freestyle ranting. Sorry that I don't have, if you just Google Erich Fromm book list, and one of them is like The Will to Love or something like that. And it's like an absolute groundbreaking and like a classic psychology text. But that's kind of that point I made about how he also had these connections with communism, is like a lot of these people have interesting side stories. Almost all of them have interesting side stories. Like I mentioned Frankl, and he was heavily influenced obviously by World War II. You can't be more heavily influenced than literally having been a prisoner at Auschwitz. And all of these people, it's during the World War II time. Skinner and his involvement with weapon technology in the States, or Watson predates World War II, but like I'm just kind of looking around, and Milgram, like, man, so Milgram does maybe the most controversial study of all time, right, in his prison experiments. And this idea, and the timing was huge, right? Do I have, Yeah, I have Milgram on there too. So Stanley, Milgram, and Zimbardo at the bottom, sort of second last row, kind of go together explaining wise. Because now think about this, because this is historically right after World War II. So these two are a little bit later than a lot of the people on this list. And what had happened in Nazi Germany shook everyone in the world to the core. And there was this desire to be able to think that it was just like the Germans had, there was something uniquely evil there. And Zimbardo and Milgram's experiments, one was about, you've probably heard of Milgram's experience on social psychology, or basically on the willingness to do what you're being told by authority. His studies were called like studies on obedience is the word. How obedient are you to authority? Again, a topic that has no relevance for today. And then wink, and you know, I'm just trying to be a little bit funny. It's like, I wonder what Milgram would have to say about our current situation. And then Zimbardo. So Zimbardo is doing the Stanford prison experiments. And both these experiments are basically finding that people that are good people in bad situations can do reprehensible things, which again hurts the worldview if you're trying to think of everything as being uniquely German evil. Then we have Watson, right? Watson, like, basically, well, like literally coins the term behaviorism, right? And he does what in hindsight would probably be viewed as, not probably, definitely, at least traumatic, if not straight up child abuse, in teaching little Albert to fear certain visual sensations and animals and stuff like that because of an association with this super loud metal bang sound, right? The little Albert experiments. But Watson had this huge impact, and he has the saying of like, if I'm gonna maybe get this wrong, but the general idea of like, you know, give me any kid and I'll turn them into a plumber or a soldier or a doctor. It's all about like crafting the right behavioral training situation, basically, to construct a certain behavioral pattern. So you can see how this is behaviorism. And then Bandura. So let me see where I'm at here. I've touched a lot of these. Skinner, we touched on the course, but again, in this Watson line of behavioralism, and Skinner really trying to learn, okay, well, how is behavior influenced by the result of the behavior? What the word he uses, which is sometimes confusing to people, is the consequence, right? You do something and there's a consequence. And how does that consequence affect your future behavior? That consequence might be a punishment, but that consequence might also be a reward, or his word was reinforcement, so that behaviors get reinforced. And we just covered this in class, but that's where he kind of fits. And again, like his association with the war effort and Project Orcon, we've already talked about. And then Sabina Spellrein, I tried to put her right in the middle of kind of graphically of it, her and Adler. Because they're so difficult to place. And so Spellrein doesn't have a huge influence in some sense. She's not probably in most of your textbooks. If you haven't seen the movie A Dangerous Method, you may never have even heard of her. Dangerous Method's a movie that looks at the relationship between Freud and Jung. And so this is what you need to know about her. She was a woman that was in a triangle with Freud and Jung, and both of them were completely, what's the word I'm looking for? Enamored? Does that mean like so intensely, almost in love with her mind? You probably thought I was going to say with like her looks or something, and she was beautiful too. So, but the point I'm making is like they talked about her as being on the same level, right? So even so much so is that her idea once at a party, she mentioned something to Freud that led to him coming up with this idea of Thanos, or this death instinct, that became like a major part of his later writings. And so she has this very interesting story where she's right in the middle of this social circle of people at the beginning of the field. And a lot of these people that we look up to were intellectually considering her as in that field. It's just, that's what I'm saying. She's hard to historically looking back, her impact isn't as specific. Like, yeah, she had this idea about the death instinct, and she's difficult to place, but she's absolutely a giant of psychology. I touch on Wilbur is more contemporary, more recent, and he took this idea of integral theory, or like, it's a very holistic, more new agey, in the kind of best sense of that word. Adler, I've kind of touched on, is the second Viennese school. So there's sort of the three big schools that come out of Vienna, all psychoanalytic. The first one's Freud, the second one's Adler, the third one's Jung. Melanie Klein. So she had this idea, so interesting. And she was huge, giant of psychology in general. So a lot of these people, when I'm saying she's huge because of this, I'm trying to kind of give you a starting point, and kind of, when I think of Melanie Klein, I think of object relation theory, right? So it's like this idea that, like, you don't really relate to me, you relate to the object that you think I am, and how we relate to objects. It's in some ways a study of perception and sensation, and also how that plays out at a group social dynamic. So she's big in areas of, like, say, for example, family therapy, and since I say family therapy, if you're interested in that, Virginia Satir's in that realm too. So I'd say Virginia Satir and family therapy specifically is a little bit more applied and practical, whereas Melanie Klein's a little bit more at the level of, like, intellectual, philosophical sort of. Now, I'm not saying that Klein's smarter. I just mean, like, if you read her, she's trying to explain the dynamics of perception. So that's inherently theoretical. Satir's trying to explain interpersonal, almost like game theory of situations of families, right? How dynamics work, how the relationship between mom and dad affect the relationship between dad and one of the kids, or something like that. And these interdynamics is what she's interested in. We touched on Zimbardo and Milgram. So let me just go through this final row. So Seligman starts the whole game of positive psychology, or the whole branch, I guess I should say, of positive psychology, in this idea that, like, people. So his critique is sort of that in the history of psychology, we've almost looked at it as a thermometer, and that there's a zero, and that people fall below that zero, and psychology's goal is to bring them back up to zero, back up to, like, normal, quote unquote normal. And even psychology was really focused on this idea of norms and what's, like, standards, so that we can have baselines, is another big word. And so then one of Seligman's critiques is that there's a lot of ignoring of, if we go back to that thermometer example, of what's higher than zero, and that there's all these ways we can apply psychology in his model, which he calls his PERMA model, which I don't think I've talked to you about yet, but which I will. And I'm doing a whole thing on positive psychology next term, by the way, as a special interest course. If people are interested, it's a fourth year level course, psych course. But if you're my students and you're interested, and you just kind of write me a short email that says you're interested, I can waive the prerequisites or whatever. Because if you're into this stuff and you're interested, it's like, I don't care if you're first year or second year, if you're into it and ready to do the work, you can join my class. You'd be more than welcome. Anyways, so next, Fritz Pearls. So I'm going to be focusing on that class on positive psychology and how that applies to things like leadership and coaching, and kind of like real family and community building, or I don't know, I'll think of a way to phrase it. Fritz Pearls was huge in this field called Gestalt therapy, and this is another kind of more response to the bigger movement of psychology. And his idea is that we actually have to view the person as a Gestalt, as a full picture, as not just a combination of parts, but as that combination of parts being something more than the sum. As I said that sentence like backwards, but that you're more than the sum of your parts. But what that would actually mean if you actually believe that, and that we actually think in Gestalts, we think in these full engaged processes. He's a tough one to get your head around, but if you've never heard of him, it'd be a fun project. And remember, I'm not looking for you to write the most comprehensive paper in the world about every idea these people ever had. And you could spend your entire academic school career writing papers on concepts that Freud presented, right? Because your textbook, and I don't mean to constantly sound like I'm dissing how other psychologists, teachers or whatever, or textbook makers or whatever talk about Freud, but I guess I kind of am doing that. And part of it is just like he is misrepresented constantly. He had flaws, but you wouldn't be in a psychology class if you didn't exist. Now, maybe, I don't know, take that with a grain of salt. I think you know what I'm saying there. Okay, so there's, almost forgot the kind of weirdest guy on the list. And I mean that with love. He's an interesting guy. And if you ever Google the name Albert Ellis and just watch a few of his videos, you'll kind of get a feel of what I mean. He's very practical and he's very no BS. And he invented this style called the rational emotive behavioral therapy, where he said, like, one of our problems is we try to think ourselves through issues, but the story we're trying to think ourselves through isn't even rational to begin with. So we're using this like diluted interpretation of things and then being like, can you help me work through my diluted interpretation of things? And his idea is like, no, we got to cut straight to the real story and realize what's a construction. And if we don't do that, if we're not rational about our emotions, so he's actually saying like a rational, and you think about, it'd be an interesting question for you to answer on an essay sometime, is like, how is that different than like CBT or like cognitive behavioral therapy? And it's similar idea, right? Because rational and cognitive, or rationality is an expression of cognition. There's similar ideas, right? And then he kind of adds this idea of emotion too. So it'd be like kind of like cognitive emotional behavioral therapy. And he's saying like, we can use our ability to think abstractly to help us limit the ability of emotions to affect our behavior when that effect is resulting in negative outcomes for us. Interesting guy. Okay, so I tried to include a pretty big variety of everything from people that are like super mainstream, like, who's the most like mainstream name on this list? Maybe Maslow, to like someone like Spellrein, or I didn't mention. Oh, sorry. Okay, this can be a couple minutes longer. I noticed 3 I didn't mention. I didn't mention Rand, Hornet, or Vygotsky. Vygotsky, about the zone of proximal development and his cultural historical perspective that basically learning is situated in the world in which the learner learns. And therefore, if that learner was to learn in a different social world, the experience would be different. The cultural historical situation matters. Cultural historical psychology. And then you got, who should I do next? These are both kind of tough to explain quickly, but Karen Horney, psychoanalyst, one of the original feminists in psychology, and had a huge impact. If you don't know who that is, that'd be an awesome one to use as your assignment. And another interesting one, if you don't know who it is Ayn Rand. And she's kind of positioned, I should have put her name beside William James, because they're kind of in this role of talking about things like objectivism and functionalism, which is almost psychology, but still heavily philosophical. And it's right about at the time when Freud's about to bust onto the scene. They're all sort of the same time of this turn of the century, right? And Ayn Rand's interesting too, because she's not really in this debate as a psychologist. She's just writing these 2 books. Well, she wrote more than 2, but these 2 main fiction books, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, that had this like huge effect just on, they became really famous books about this idea of objectivism and functionalism, and had this I keep saying this word, but this disproportional influence, meaning like lots of people wrote books around 1900. Not many of them had the influence on the mind of people like Atlas Shrugged. All right. I think that's my overview. I have no idea how long it is, because I don't got, when I'm recording this screen share in Zoom, it doesn't have like a ticker like PowerPoint. But all right, hope that was decent and gave you a little bit of a start, at least, on which one you maybe think is more interesting, and maybe even where to start your research project. process, I would just start Googling the person and read about them as much as you can, and then sit back and be like, what is, and maybe when you're reading, you've come across a couple core ideas, right, that you really want to highlight. But I want you to spend a little bit of time reading about these people and realizing these were people that were like deep thinkers, that their ideas that we often touch on in a class are like, it's almost like we're looking at musicians and it's like we only know everybody's top 40 hit, and that's what makes it to the textbook. But they all had full albums that hit came from. I don't know if that metaphor worked or not. I'm way too deep in this video to restart because of a bad metaphor. So I hope that kind of worked. And I'll see you in the next video. I laugh with my Conestoga students that I'm the worst at ending videos of all time, but you've had some examples now. Love you all. You're great students. Again, shoot me an email if you need anything. I'm gonna try this afternoon and tonight to try to really catch up on email. And take care.